Jeopardy music first. I
Oh
don't
yeah.
know.
Oh yeah.
And the other comment is, I thought a seance is where we try to reach the dead. So anyway, yeah, thanks, Perry. You called me and said, come on this thing, and I said digital scar tissue, and yeah, I mean, for my sins, I've run around the planet quite a bit for IBM a couple of times, two different tours, and between those, about 10 years with Microsoft, when we thought we had something called Exchange Online before the cloud, and we decided to go to Coca-Cola first and see if they'd be interested in coming on board. We had no data centers. In fact, I had to go back to my old shop at IBM and plead with them, could we use your data centers, please? Because we didn't have any. And that was then, and this is now. And since then, we went through BPOS and into Office 365, and now Microsoft 365, and a whole bunch of other things. And we played with something called Office Communications, which was became Lync, if any of us remember, LYNC. And then we decided, to hell with this, we'll go and buy Skype, and we went to them and we acquired it. It wasn't enterprise ready, and we had to do some work on it to make it so. So yeah, I mean, in terms of, and I'm not sure, Perry, where you want me to go, but data has always been key and fundamental. I mean, today I find it ironic, quite frankly. No reflection on Mark Zuckerberg, but here's Facebook faced with an issue, pretty substantive, around their size and question mark monopoly of having WhatsApp and Instagram in the equation. And I wind that clock back many years to Microsoft when we had Explorer embedded in our technology. And my old boss then, Steve Ballmer, was any color you like, so long as it's Windows. And we had a competing browser called Netscape, if any of us can remember that.
Oh yeah.
A bloody good browser, I'll be honest, a bloody good browser, better than Explorer. And we didn't want to let that baby in. And so much like Facebook today, they've got so many hooks in the equation to protect their overall monopoly or investment. It's going to be very hard to break it up. And that raises the issue to me, and has been something I've been concerned about all the way through, and probably more so now that I'm retired, around privacy and trust and security. We know security is a different element to privacy, but what's happening with that data? Who's got it? Today, my old mate Larry Ellison is running around with Walmart, acquiring TikTok. Well, the secret source of that is staying in China with the ByteDance folks. But there's going to be a lot of data floating around. So, basically, data is becoming more and more prevalent around the equation. So, Perry, I don't know how far you want me to go, but basically, the whole thing around organizations, it's very much, they have to protect themselves. We all know that. If any of us who work or own organizations know, you've got to be very careful in competition. But at the same time, there's a balance in that competition, and who owns the data, where it exists, what it's doing becomes pretty key. And the last thing I would say is around content. And the other thing we're seeing a lot of more lately is, who do you trust? That information that's coming out, is it the right information? How do you adjudicate, if you do or can, on the source of that information? Is it disinformation, misinformation, and what's being done with it? I can tell you this in an R&D context from both Microsoft and IBM, and I'm not spilling the beans here, but basically, when you've got large amounts of data, you want to dig into that data and find out what is relevant for you as an organization to add to your competitiveness, and dare I say, to be won over your competitors in the ecosystem. So anyway, I'll stop there, Perry. I don't know.
David, when we all became aware that change was imminent, and I can recall Y2K, which had something to do with data that looked like it wasn't properly coded and was going to create a crisis, which didn't quite happen, although maybe it was a warning. I can recall the days when we were told, if you're not in e-commerce next year, you're out of business. Well, that was a little bit of a hype a little early. It didn't see COVID coming. I don't think it saw a lot of things coming, but it was a warning. We're hearing today things like, well, youth are telling us that one of their major concerns is the arrival of algorithms and analytics that may displace jobs, and they wonder whether there will be a future of work for them. These are pretty exaggerated, almost existential questions, but when you were working with Ernst & Young and IBM and Microsoft, was anybody really concerned with the threats that data and the usage of data might present, or was it always utopia, it's just around the corner?
Well, I think, Perry, it became something where, possession was 9/10 of the law, right? So if you had data that could differentiate you in some way, shape or form to your competitive ecosystem, or make you better in the eyes and consumption of the consumers, the users, and add to value of the shareholders, because it was always the three-legged stool, right? Doing things right for the shareholders, employees, and obviously the users. So, a lot of time was spent on studying what that data can do for the organization to benefit it. Obviously, you hope there was a parallel with that. Well, what was it doing for the good of the user? You were obviously intending to enhance your product or your services, to improve the value to the customer, so they continue to buy more of you. So it's a tough one. Government's role. You've been in government. What role should government have? EY, and I use them along with other entities to come in and adjudicate and assess, and could be anything from ethical hacking to assessments of what an organization was doing. Obviously had to take the view that their data was their data. And so in the agreements, and I don't want to take us down the legal tangent, one of the issues with agreements was, from a customer's perspective, making sure that data, if it was your data, that it remained your data, and it was shielded from use by either another tenant, another customer, or the organization providing the services.
Yeah, it's how that data is being used today. I mean, you and I have shared some literature. There's a book, if those of you that are interested in doing some reading on this, called, I think it was called Surveillance Capitalism, which was, if you've got data, what are the driving forces that will drive you as an organization? How would you use that data? Well, you use it for profit. You use it to maximize the value to the shareholder. Well, you see that if the data allows me to get more and more information about the individual, the positive is personalization. I'll use the data to make your experience with me or with my organization so positive that it'll be sticky. You won't want to go anywhere else. But that's a form of behavior modification, a form of, but presumably positive, because it's helping you do what the analytics say you want to do or you want done for you. But maybe there are people out there that would like to use the data for some other purpose that relates to what you value, your income, the privacy that you preserve regarding relationships. So I can recall when at a conference on analytics, big data in the cloud, asking whether IBM was at all concerned with the possibility of data actually displacing professions. And I admired IBM of talking about Watson as an aid, not as an alternative. That was either a brilliant marketing decision or their heart was in the right place. David, were you around, or did you want to comment?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Jeopardy scenario was also, one which got a lot of, and at IBM we were very, you talk about artificial intelligence. At IBM we prefer to say augmented intelligence, so that it augments what you do, rather than artificially, or whatever is the analogy, does something else. And the whole robotics thing, I remember doing a radio show on one occasion where the folks got into it with me around, are robots going to replace all of us humans? And the answer to that should be no. I had to say no at the time, but basically from a process perspective, these bots exist in software and they do things which possibly could be done by humans, but do it faster, more effectively. We know we've all heard about quantum computing. That was another thing that at the time we were playing with at IBM, and has become hopefully more effective to scientists, to researchers in doing things, whether it's creating a vaccine for, AstraZeneca or Pfizer, you pick them, a vaccine in this COVID situation, or we're trying to solve polio, as Bill's trying to do, and Melinda at the foundation. You get back to, I have to say this, one of the biggest things I found in dealing with customers was, is it going to take things off me that I should keep? Is it going to take my people away or cause me to have to get rid of people in the equation? Because that became a big topic. It's an emotional topic. It's certainly, if it gets into the political space, it becomes a real hot potato. A government is trying to develop their GDP, whether it's in Canada or a province or another country, and therefore the issue becomes then, well, hang on a minute, workers are going to be displaced. So it's all about that balance.
So Robert, why don't you open up your mic? You can pose that question directly that you posed to me. Why don't you pose it directly to David and engage him in the response to the question you've got?
Well, I've got several questions.
One at a time.
But just from an intellectual or sort of intangible asset perspective, did Microsoft ever capitalize the development costs of its software on its balance sheet?
Yeah, I saw your question, Robert. I haven't had a chance to reply to it. I mean, the thing was, and again, here's another issue about change. And again, I'm not spilling the beans. I mean, Microsoft moved from a capital purchase acquisition to organizations acquiring their technology through operating expense.
Right.
And that sounds easy. That was a huge, significant thing. When we were, as I say, developing this Exchange Online, and we took Active Directory federated services and we put it on steroids, and that became Azure. And I remember Steve Ballmer at the time, he did not like us one iota. I mean, we were a bunch of skunk work loonies who were going to take away the business. So that change caused the change backwards, back to your point around the balance sheet. How would we represent as an organization? Now, we founded, I forget when, back in the 70s, Microsoft had been operating on a capital purchase arrangement. You bought the stuff. Mm-hmm. Going to a utility basis swung the whole thing around.
Right.
So that was my answer there. If I was Jeff Bezos at Amazon, okay, I started off with an online bookstore. That was fine and dandy. I'd buy a book. Then when I got into web services, and if Werner Vogels could speak to this better than I could, basically it became a much different issue for them, because they could start off straight away on a utility basis. They didn't have the boat anchor of capital purchase arrangement.
Right. Okay. It's interesting because I use Microsoft's origins as the kind of starting part of the point of the creative revolution. They were the first ones. Bill was one of the first to think of software as an asset and not just as a sell for service. But before Microsoft, people would produce software and then sell it and think nothing of they would keep nothing for themselves. And so the idea that licensing it to IBM, maintaining the rights to MS-DOS separate, was the first time that an intangible of really significant commercial value had been treated like an asset.
Yeah.
And of course the rest is history. But what I find interesting about the whole technological revolution is the question of ownership. I mean, we go back to data, and it's my belief that if the ownership rights of data in the analog world are very clear. If you take an analog picture of somebody, you have to get their permission. And if you use that picture for newspaper purposes or any other purposes, and there's a potential tort, because if it's using my data to make value for you, then potentially you leave yourself open to litigation. So filmmakers, for instance, and photographers in those old days were very careful about getting sign-offs for anybody who happened to be in this line of sight of their camera. That all seemed to disappear in the digital age. The idea that there is an ownership right in your image, in your in your life, in all the aspects of your life, it seems to be the simplest thing to do in order to democratize the world of data, is to establish those individual rights of property.
And there's a challenge there, Robert. And we got involved in some things, to do with security. I mean, the UK, you probably detect from the accent. It's probably I guess next to certain places in China and other places around there, the most highly surveilled place on the planet. Right. And it's constantly taking pictures, and it's constantly looking things. And now we apply virtual reality, and now we apply artificial intelligence, and now we look for things. And if it's a certain looking thing, there's a certain reaction. The technology is in there. I think the challenge is how do you control that? Because you've got government on the one hand, you've got private enterprise on the other. Private enterprise is there to, dare we say it, make money, and to be able to put more research investment in and build the next thing and the next thing and so on. The more of this that's happened, the more prevalent it is, and it is significantly more prevalent now than it was when I started out in it. Getty Images, okay, it was a Getty image. I own the image. If I used it and they found out, I'd get a communication to say, you owe us money.
Yeah, that's right.
I've seen that. But we some of us, maybe we're thinkers. I don't know. Maybe we're more headlights than we are tailpipes. But one way or another, we've been watching this evolution. And Europe seems to have moved faster than the United States. The United States is only now beginning to get into a discussion. I don't know whether it'll ever happen or when it will happen in Canada. But either the issue of trust is not of particular interest. I'm wondering whether we have a generational issue here on this subject of trust, which I think we'll investigate in more depth next week. But I'm stunned to see that society at large, the media, the governments in general, don't seem to be taking this issue of privacy terribly seriously. Those in the business know it's an issue. Robert, you've raised it. David, it's an issue. And yet government that's supposedly protecting the interests of the public hasn't stepped up. Are they over lobbied? Why is government so slow to pick up this issue?
I don't think they understand the commercial value of it, or how to use the data. We were modeling
the value, Robert, is a positive.
Well, of course, it's positive.
The issue.
We modeled that if our local and federal governments got our data and used it commercially, they could have our tax burden.
But that's the positive. I agree with you. But it seems to me most people that want to discuss privacy discuss it from the negative. It's going to hurt me. It's going to do some damage. Big bad capitalism is nasty. The lady who wrote the book on surveillance capitalism said capitalism will take this to its own advantage and not pay much particular attention to what the needs of the individual are. That's when government ought to step in to protect the individual. But you posed the point, Robert, that no, it has positive value. Sure, it does.
Absolutely, it does. And it's a form of property that ought to be. We ought to have a serious discussion about the ownership of that very valuable property.
Well, Zuckerberg, I gather, at the hearing in Congress recently, has agreed that it ought to be regulated. There ought to be more regulation around data, around Facebook, around...
Well, capitalism needs rules. Capitalism needs to understand where property boundaries are. Otherwise, it gets into messes like Zuckerberg is now. That without... You see, possession is 9/10 of the law. That's true, but the last tenth is juristic possession.
Okay,
which
well,
the
we're going
Romans
to get back to this.
invented.
It's
And that's the legalistic form of that property. Whether it's in your possession or not, you have a right and title to it.
okay.
And we can thank the
We'll hear
Romans for that. But
we'll hear more from you next week, Robert, because I'm going to ask you to join us next week when we talk about ownership and trust. But thank you, David. I know you've got some other engagement coming up.
Yeah.
So I promise you could run first, but thank you very much for joining us today. And next we'll hear from Wayne. Wayne Karpoff, you're there next to your Christmas tree. Wayne, you're the CEO of Willow Glen Systems, a global firm employing software engineering for industrial automation. That's pretty big. When not traveling the globe, your passion is in the development of the so-called innovation ecosystem for helping entrepreneurs survive, grow, and succeed. You've got 12 minutes. Viewers, again, please use your chat to pose any questions or comments you may have for Wayne. Wayne, you're on.
Okay, I'm going to start and break the cardinal rule of speaking and start with 3 apologies right off the top. First, have you ever had that experience of being put on stage and then the introduction you get realizes that you've picked the exact wrong topic? So my interpretation of the digital economy really, perhaps this little bit of anchoring bias of what's worrying me right now has to do with how do we create, companies and stuff that drives our economy in Alberta in particular, rather than waiting for the oil and gas space to recover on things. And so it actually fits the words of the title, but not the introduction that Perry just gave in the beginning of all this. So I leave it to Perry's discretion whether you want to give me a big hook on this, but I'm going to proceed down that rather than making up a new presentation on the fly, which I probably could do. But hey. The second apology is this is a snippet of a much longer and deeper talk. I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of it, and I'm going to go through it quite quickly on that. So there's a bit of warp speed going on. The third apology is the data that I'm going to reference is purposely a bit out of date, a couple of years out of date, because I didn't want it biased by oil crash crises or pandemic crises or things like that. And so with that, I would like to share with you, hopefully my slides. So you should see a big black slide in front of you.
Perfect.
Great. Okay. And so the key thesis that I want to sell is there's some urgency right now. We've talked about this for decades, about the potential of our digital economy being companies that can create digital technologies and things like that, driving our economy. There's no more urgency now. We have to shift that into high gear. Because what are we going to do? Are we going to wait for the oil and gas industry to recover? I don't think so. How about tourism, which is another big driver of Alberta's economy? Don't think that's it either. The third largest driver of Alberta's GDP right now is knowledge-based industries, and most people don't even know that. But how do we create companies that will actually create, firstly, local value and then export around the world? And how do we do that at a pace that's orders of magnitude that's faster than what we've done before? And I have to say, and so my thesis on this is, as Perry says, I am an entrepreneur, a tech entrepreneur. It almost sounds like I'm apologizing for the 12-step program when I say that, but that's the way I think. And so I've started thinking about how to do this in a way that leaves the traditional way of driving, the growth of a market segment from government think, let me call it that way, which is safe, incremental, step by step. How do I look at it saying the whole economy is an entrepreneurial experience? It's as if I'm creating a new startup. And how would I change the way I do that? And, so I've always created companies that are swing to the fence, looking for those billion-dollar squares. And I've done that several times. I'm chasing a billion-dollar square again right now. And so I'm a swing for the fence type of a tech entrepreneur. How do I apply that training and experience to let's create the whole Alberta economy over again and start all of that stuff again? And so if I look at things that we've learned, and I'll turn to St. Geoffrey Moore and from Crossing the Chasm, and if I looked at where we are in the economy today, I would say that we're somewhere dangling between the early innovators and early adopters space. We're creating companies one at a time and celebrating everyone that goes out to the door. And we're surrounding, everyone that goes out with a swack of engineers and accountants and mentors and things like that. And it's good, and we need to do that, but it's not scaling to what we need to do. So we say, well, how do we approach the problem differently so we can get into that early majority, big curve, so we're recognized in Alberta as being a global center on that stuff and apply engineering speeds on that. So the first thing that we need to think about is we entrepreneurs are trained to not do the let's start a journey of 1,000 miles with one step, but where do we want to get to? What's going to change the world? What's the big, audacious goal sort of syndrome? We work backwards. Government works forwards. We think it backwards. If I'm going to achieve a big BHAG, I need to start at the end point and work backwards. Well, in Alberta, and again, this is slightly out of date, the GDP of Alberta is about $494 billion. So if we're going to have an impact from technology in the space, we need to do it at a scale that achieves that sort of level on things. A couple of years ago, Craig from Mount Royal was making a lot of waves of let's create 150 startups. And that was a pretty big number because U of A typically creates about 18 companies a year. So 150 sounds like a really big deal. Let's create 150 companies, but do the math on that in terms of the revenue that they can contribute to the GDP. It doesn't even come close to hitting the noise. So I maintain we need to think in terms of let's create 5,000 startups. What does that look like? Let's think big and think backwards to what we do. And why 5,000 startups? Well, let's work backwards again. If I say wanted 100 companies, that say created 20, that were over that $20 million space, so that's a couple $1 billion, that's good. I need to have, let's say, 10 companies that will go from 1,000, from that over $2 million space where we tend to get stuck into the $20 million space. Okay. And then I need to get 5,000 startups into the 1,000, into that, 5,000 startups that are past that conceptual phase that have some early traction into that, crossing that $2 million level. Right there, by the way, and I can go to, constraint analysis, we have a problem because our success ratio from going from that early startup conceptual, past the conceptual, first early traction into crossing the $2 million space, we're currently about 1 in 15. We need to get that down to 1 in 5. So right off the top, I have a problem that I need to solve. But let's keep going on this. What does that look like? Let's create 5,000 startups. What do we need to create 5,000 startups? Well, 5,000 startups at $500,000 of seed money per company. That's $2.5 billion of seed capital that we need almost overnight. Oh, where are we going to get that? I need 2.5 million early adopters of those products at, say, 5 customers per company. I need 10,000 entrepreneurs, that are going to drive this. And stats show that startups that have 2 entrepreneurs are way more successful than 1. Ergo, that's why I need 10,000 of those. At the next level, once you hit the 2 million, that means I also need another $25 billion worth of A and B round financing. And don't get me wrong, there's lots of ways to fund a company. I'm throwing a generic wad on here, but the numbers can move around a bit. Let's not argue that. Lots of growth capital. I need $12 billion of working capital in a banking system that doesn't know how to do things beyond fixed assets right now. How are we going to solve that problem? And now I need 5,000 growth stage executives that have never done this before. How am I going to create that? The carrot's huge, though. Now we're up to $2 billion of revenue from that grouping, with 25,000 employees. So I'm motivated to do it. How am I going to solve those problems? Then, of course, at the next level, it goes on. I need more mezzanine funding, and I need more employees, and I won't dwell on this because I'm going fast. So what do we do? So let's look at some of these problems. Okay, decompose. $2.5 billion of seed funding for the province of Alberta alone. What do we do? That seems unfathomable. I mean, we just celebrated getting, AEC from 100 million up to 150 million in leverage funding, and that's hardly touching the thing. The seed fund that came out of that was 10 million, for seed funding. So, I mean, that's a pretty big step. So let's talk to Malcolm Gadwell's thing. So he says, how do you create an Uber? So what you do is you go into the world and you say, here's some excess capacity that could be transformed and leveraged. You create a novel way. So in the case of Uber, there's lots of people with cars and extra time to go out and drive and do things. So that's great. They could, do something different with that because they're parked most of the time anyway. Then you create a novel way to exploit that capacity. So let's create some fancy software and things like that will allow that to hit the market. And then you have to create a metaphor so that people will understand it and can rally behind it. Oh, great. This is the next generation of taxi cabs at half the price with better service. That's the kind of paraphrased version of how to create an Uber based on Geoffrey Moore. So how does that solve my $2.5 billion of seed financing? I would observe that in 1 year, the RRSP contribution by Albertans into RSPs is $5.8 billion. 1 year. 1 year of surplus capacity that's now sitting around. The bank rate just went down to 0.25% at base rate. Not getting good investment at a time where altruistic investment is huge. I would argue that there's a latent capacity that we could leverage. We have to remove the barriers to it. We have to create some easy ways for them doing it. We have to change security rules. We have to create altruistically driven and marketed RSPs. We have to do things like that to make it easy. We have to wrap a metaphor around it, invest here to not only protect your investment, but help build the next economy. But I would say we can solve that problem by taking that type of an approach. By the way, here's another slide. This one is current. This is from 2 days ago. This is the EDC's quarterly update on economic forecasts. If you haven't seen this recording, this is the most interesting economic forecast I've ever seen, period. It's recorded. You can get it by logging into the EDC website. This particular graph I stole from it. The bottom line is the amount of money that's normally hitting people's bank accounts, on-demand savings and deposits and things. This is what's normal. The upper line is what's happened since the pandemic. Meaning that people aren't spending money on traveling and things like that. It's hitting their bank account. There's this huge amount of discretionary funding that's growing over the next few months that could be very quickly deployed and doing interesting things if we found a metaphor for doing that. So there's a current slide for you, if you will, on doing things. Where the heck am I going to find 36,000 software engineers? Well, let's go and take some stuff from Goldrat's theory of constraints. Goldrat was, of course, a Jewish entrepreneur and had looked at things from a constraint sort of management. So the constraint really is, we say, well, we don't have 36,000 software developers and software engineers and stuff like that, and so therefore we can't do it. So if we kind of deploy that type of logic, we would realize that we're looking at the problem wrong. We actually have lots of engineers around. It's just they aren't software engineers. So one of my good friends, Randy Marsden, a great Alberta entrepreneur that sold his company, is now, quote, living the dream in California, working for Apple, points out the difference between a software engineer and any other type of engineer is 3 terms worth of education. 3 terms worth of education. And what's more is if we could convert those engineers, they not only come with the software skills and things we need, they come with decades of domain experience from our backyard that will allow us to be much more innovative companies. What do we need to do that? We need to change an education system so that we can retool them at warp speed. It's funny, we all went to university at the beginning and started our coursework, and we showed up after our summer vacation and smoozed with our friends and things like that. And then, of course, the prof comes in with a bit of a smirk on his face and hits us with a fire hose of information. You say, holy crap, I wish I'd prepped for this one, that pace of education. Somehow when we get old, we think that we have to go to this training wheel style of education that if you show up and breathe, you're going to pass. We need to change the way we do that and leverage our institutions for doing that. Where am I going to get 2.5?
You've got 5 minutes, and we've got a number of questions we want to pose to you. How much longer in the presentation?
5 minutes will do. Actually, 3 minutes will do.
Right.
So the next problem I picked on is where am I going to get 2.5 million early entrepreneurs at 5 per company? Let's look at Clayton Christensen. He's a Harvard professor that wrote something called The Innovator's Dilemma. and say, well, if we replicate from the bottom, I believe that we can do that. So the punchline on this, and this, by the way, is a talk by itself, is we need to create an economy in Alberta of what I call active early adopters, where our cornerstone players who desperately need technology need to retool how they engage companies to drive this the local adoption. This is a win-win-win type of thing. If I only got one thing to do in economy, it would be this. And again, I can do a 2-hour talk on this one by itself. Other things we've got to do is we've got to work at the speed of innovation, not at the speed of government. Companies, time is our enemy as an entrepreneur. That's not the way we behave within our industry. Finally, we need to retool a little bit in terms of how we create the culture shift. Every great sports team and every entrepreneur know the same thing. You have to create a perceived culture around that cheers everybody along with you. That's how you drive your early adopters. That's how you drive your staff. It's how you drive your recruiting and things like that. We need to figure out how to do that in the tech sector. And I will stop with that.
Thank you very, very much. This is stimulating, and actually it takes us into the whole arena that kicked all of this off on economic diversification and what might be done about it. And I've just sent you a note asking whether or not we might have some offline discussions. But I'm going to ask you a question really early, because you asked, where might there be a surplus, excess capacity of software engineers? I can recall a few years ago someone pointing out how many companies we have in Edmonton at the entrepreneurial level that are in the software business that have never considered merging.
Yeah.
Now, he pointed out to me, we have 500 companies in Edmonton, all of whom, if we were to bulk them up, begin to show us some capacity to scale, but they all work in isolation and complain about their lack of success. How do you go about providing some degree of leadership to begin to bring these companies together?
Well, again, it's according to the SIC codes, again, this is a 2-year-old statistic, there are 5,400 companies in Alberta that are in the IT sector alone. We don't even know where they all are, but that's according to the SIC code, so they're out there somewhere. And so the challenge becomes one of, we have a fairly service-oriented type of a nomenclature for the people that are out there, but clearly there's an opportunity, I think, to reharness things that we do on contract to things that we can turn and productize and build and do other things. The key element is how the customers are regarding the reaction with those things. Walk around downtown Calgary and notice all the empty floors that used to be filled with engineers. Edmonton, a little less so, but still. Again, we can retool those people and retool them, I think, quite quickly and create really interesting and meaningful careers and companies that come out of that. We have the capacity. Finally, you probably don't know this. The University of Alberta is the most prolific engineering college in the country right now. We need to put out the portion of people that leave the province because there's no work here is growing. I think we need to redirect there a bit.
Well, it requires some degree of leadership, and I don't know whether or not we have in Calgary, for example, people helping engineers today make the proper conversion from one industry to another and develop the skill sets for a digital economy.
So again, I look at it from the perspective of where do you want to get to? Let's use a metaphor. If you're an out-of-work engineer, you're looking for a job. It's not gonna click to you that says, oh, if I do this, I can help transform a province in terms of being a new generation economy, or that I can improve our cornerstones with better digitization and stuff to make it even our cornerstone companies still stronger. You need to create that war cry behind it. You need to remove the barriers to make them easy to get there. You need to make it efficient. You need to make it self-satisfying. You need to make it so that they know where they're going to go at the end of that investment. So,
anybody want to pose any question? I've got one here again from Robert. Can governments change? I think he's asking whether or not the government can play a role in helping convert these early adopters into. Well, Robert, you want to pose the question?
Well, I remember I had a chat with Randy Marsden about his experience with the Alberta government, which was horrendous.
Yeah.
He goes in and he works with the department. I forget which department it was, and does a full kimono on the technology. Tells them everything that this can do for the Alberta government. they love the idea. Then they exclude him from the RFP because he's an insider.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I don't know who won the deal, IBM or something. But
Yeah.
if the Alberta government won't invest in Albertans
Yeah.
and won't be that early adopter when they have the biggest budget and the biggest need for innovation, then we're doomed.
Yeah.
This,
Yeah, and by the way, it's more than that. It's so I've coined the term active early adopter as opposed to just early adopter.
Yeah.
And by that I mean early adopter. People says, yeah, I'll put it into my RFP process. No, this is way before this.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it should be way before that. Yeah.
So it's this mix of I, as a company, realized that if I could solve this problem, it would make me more competitive. So very non-altruistic approach of doing that. But take the step of saying that, gee, if I do this in a way that says I need to take a company, I need to not only solve the problem I need, but nurture them to make sure that it's commercially relevant beyond my company. And working from the whiteboard all the way through to being a reference at the back end and understand that's part of my role in being an active early adopter.
Yeah.
You have a much more successful thing and you create an ecosystem of doing that. I will tell you with all my companies, the pin has been finding those active early adopters. They've tended to be south of the border and they have tended to be actually in US spaces. So my last company, Yada Yada, the early adopters were three-letter agencies in the United States that figured out decades ago that they needed to accelerate technology but didn't want to spend $500 on a custom hammer. Therefore, They went into these processes with a very different approach of finding companies that could solve those problems, nurturing them through the whole innovation side, including the commercialization, helping them take it to market. So we appeared in the booths, and not even military booths, but mainstream IT booths of NASA and three-letter agencies. They helped us get America Online as one of our first commercial customers, which we could have never possibly done.
Sure. No, that's good.
Associated with it. But that role that they have of nurturing that. So if I look in, and I'm going to speak, I don't know if everybody's here from Edmonton, but I'll speak from Edmonton. I could speak broadly, but look at companies that are anchored in Edmonton. And I'm not even talking about oil and gas. That's an easy topic. But look at companies like Leadcore, PCL, companies like that need a rapid transition on who they are and how they compete on a world basis. And technology is a big part of that. And if they don't innovate, they will die. What are their choices? They can wait for the leftovers from the US. They can try and do it in-house, but they don't know how to innovate. And besides, it's way too expensive and way too risky.
Yeah, they are risk averse. Yeah.
If they work with companies in a responsible way, they can push the risk of that down into companies that are much more nimble and much more efficient, and get much faster results out of it. So
that's a good transition point right there. In that we have reached the limit, and I indicated to Randy that a 445 startup would be about right. But as a quick summary, I mean, it's difficult to take the volume of what you've shared with us because this is a huge topic. As you know, we've spent, Wayne, you and I, maybe 20 years discussing this topic on whether or not the innovation ecosystem is adequate to support startups so that they ultimately do survive, succeed, and stay. The whole issue of whether or not the primary issue is one that government can even play a role in solving. And our data indicates that most people do not look at government as ultimately the vehicle that's going to pull us into the future. That it's got to come from the Ma and Pa from Rimby that appreciate the value to their RSPs if we could in fact encourage them, which Robert, you've been involved in. ABC Tech spun off Tuck Invest, trying to address the very point that Wayne raised, except we were looking at TFSAs of saying there's a lot of money languishing. More than
investment.
Now in Calgary right now, Jim Gray and a number of others are trying to help pool that capital and play a stronger role. Edmonton is very different than Calgary, more dominated by public services sector. But I think we'll take much of what you shared with us, Wayne, and ask you back for a discussion specifically on the barriers and the opportunities of helping to go about diversifying the economy. We've got a $60 billion hole in this economy, not $20 billion, $60 billion to be replaced to put us back where we were. It seems like an impossible transition, but with Randy's help, maybe we'll get there. So thank you, Wayne.
I would point out, if you actually play the model all the way through with the numbers that that I actually use, when you look at the spin-offs and all the other pieces come out, it actually comes out to almost exactly $60 million.
Well, I'd like to, if you wouldn't mind sharing that with us again, either through a webinar or an article. We're wide open. I think this is exactly what we need to start thinking about. And I think COVID has made it apparent that we're not going to get the turnaround.
Yeah, we need to reform capital markets.
Yep, sounds good.
Randy, you're the founder and CEO of HealthGauge, featuring a wearable health management device for live monitoring of your biometrics, or our biometrics. Randy, how is digitization affecting the future of healthcare? You've got 12 minutes.
Okay, 12 minutes. Well, first of all, I just want to say, well, thanks for the earlier presentation. And Wayne, I really like the garden perspective on innovators, you know, and of course it is a bigger topic. And one of the things that you know, really strikes me about Alberta, because we're all residents here, and you know, most of us are pretty anchored here. And so we face into this international challenge with our eyes wide open. And I know everybody here is involved in one capacity or another in trying to figure out how do we grow that garden. And one of my you know, bugaboos in Alberta has been generally the size of the sandbox, and call it the innovators sandbox when you compare it to other parts of the world. You know, and so when I look at your numbers, I think we can all agree with those, you know, those main points. You know, but the thing that really struck me is if we don't actually grow the size of the sandbox, and the willingness of what we could call client participants to let us mess around in that sandbox, we can't progress. You know, so what we've got is this incredible system, and it's not just Alberta based, but it's Canada based, where we're actually creating you know, the intelligent resources for the world. And we're not actually growing enough of the plants here, and that's you know. And I challenged you know, a big government body earlier this year, took them to task on something, and as anybody would know, the response is generally, you know, run for the cover and make sure your senior management knows there's, you know, someone wants to be a pest out there. I do that once or twice a year, because to do more than that is, you know, doesn't help. So thus these forums here. So I'm going to share a screen, and you know, my perspective on stuff is going to be pretty oriented towards digital health. But the title of this presentation is how CV19 is changing the rules of everything. And you know, and forgive me for, you know, I've been working at least 20 years now, or no, 18 plus now, generally on digital health innovation. So got a lot of bent there. But you know, the interesting thing too is that Alberta has such incredible capabilities in these areas. And so while this presentation is kind of oriented towards digital health, I really talk with the implications towards innovators. You know, but for us with HealthGauge, and Bruce Matichuk, my co-founder business partner, is also on the line here, and I want to recognize Ling Wang and Brett Duncan too, been very involved in the sector. But you're thinking about the implications for innovators. So this year we kind of faced one of those lifetime moments, and you know, those one of those you know, where were you when moments, and it's been really incredible year. You know, it's, you know, for us, I had some great you know, some great investor discussions started off prior to CV19, and we actually raised $2 million over the course of this year, and have spent a lot of time just nursing that that transaction along. So hopefully Wayne will be one of those companies that makes it, but we know I've got a long road ahead. But you know, we all have this amazing thing that happened this year, and so if, you know, incredible watching, you know, how everybody responded. And of course, if you run a restaurant or a hotel or, you know, a plane company, you know, airlines, hey, life is looking pretty grim, you know, because not only did we impact, and so we talk about Alberta in the context of the oil and gas sector, you know, we know the problems, you know, the challenges here, but just imagine now, not only do we have that as a hit, you know, but anything that's associated with the services industries, and they had dependencies on oil and gas too, are also now taking a massive hit. So, you know, with no small irony to the topic at hand, how fascinating is it that I could raise $2 million outside of Alberta through the course of the year? And the reason is very simple. It's because we're one of those companies that is invested in knowledge-based workforce. And so we have an incredible team that largely Bruce has been building, and I've been helping support. But that's a thing that happened this year. And how many companies can get that done? I think Ling Wang can get it done. I think there's probably other people on this call can get it done. But we're the kind of companies that have a resilience that can withstand these kinds of problems. So what happened next? Well, obviously cancel everything. Everything goes online. And those organizations that could figure out how to do that faster, frankly, most of the organizations that could figure out how to do that fast were already there. We're already able to do that. We have resources based in India, supply chain based in China, and in the United States. We're participating right now in 2 accelerator programs, one in Austin, Texas, and the other in Silicon Valley. In addition to being involved here, guess what? You don't have to fly anymore. And I'm telling you, that saves me a bundle of money, and I'm getting just as much, in fact, better knowledge transfer and connections than I had before. So, the other thing that's really fascinating we're seeing going on, and we're thinking about innovation, is what I call unglobalization. We have this international trend that was actually preceding what was going on with the CV-19. In early March, I was actually going to fly to Spain and participate in the Mobile World Congress, and 3 days later, I had to cancel all of that. And we got into this place where now we have to start to think about the definition of the essential worker and travel. That's a really, really bad place for any country to be having to contemplate, is who's, frankly, like, even the word is disturbing. The essential worker, and the essential workers are who? Right at the moment, we've got a bunch of truck drivers that are essential. Certainly have a lot of healthcare workers that are pretty essential. But it's a really good question as far as like who gets to write the rules in the next economy? Who gets to write the rules on the idea of if we're going to become nationalistic in our perspective, Canada is going to be one of those countries that has got a really big problem. And I think we have to really work hard, not just on creating companies, but ensuring that we have an ability to address mobility issues. So when you think about all these things that are going on in the dynamics and the implications for innovators, we see society, or you see countries, really, nations taking different steps. And really interesting to see, who's going to win? Who's going to win in this exercise in the future around how economies succeed? And you guys see the same thing I see. You've got full-on authoritarianism versus a staged lockdown approach, and or the other alternative is to kind of do nothing, opt for a hybrid of a herd mentality, kind of like what Sweden did. And what's the point of all of this? The point of all of this, frankly, has to be to protect your society for the future. And I tell you, I don't know which one of those is right. They all have challenges, but I think we have to kind of see that countries that have this is really weird to say, but have been a more authoritarian, and more hands-on, are kind of in a better position on competing going forward. So we kind of see some of that happening here. But I think that in the long term, that's going to be a real problem for us as innovators. I really think that we have to get back into mobility, and we have to really build strong ties, in particular with Western nations, as we don't know what's going to happen with nations that don't share our values. And I think we have to be careful and thoughtful about how we work at that. So the things we saw happening for us as a digital health company, our value went up this year, even though we're still in a startup stage. The thing that is happening is any company that is looking like it can sustain itself and grow, going forward post CV-19, are going to get funded, because there is a tremendous amount of capital, frankly, lying around in markets. And this is one of the things we discovered this year, is that it actually was looking a lot easier for start to access public markets, rather than trying to hunt around Canada and figure out like which organizations really want to bank on Canadian entrepreneurs. And it's not a big list. So public markets are looking like they could be a really great place to start looking for for us, go in, and hopefully we'll see some support or additional supports with public sector. I know we have, and I think the public sector and non-dilutive funding is going to increase this year. But the rock stars of today are the health leaders in tamping down CV-19. But I think the rock stars of tomorrow, probably later into, probably hitting into the April to June timeframe, have to be those people that are going to be leading us on the economic development front. And I'm not sure about the leadership there just yet. So preparing for the worst. I'm not sure, Perry, how much time have I got left here?
You're doing fine. We've left
okay.
a little bit of extra time at the end.
Okay, got a bit of time. So looking at now taking a bit of a take on digital tech. The health system moved to the front line in operations, and it's been really incredible starting to see how the classical health system, the traditional health system is really built around addressing sickness or when bad things happen to you. So not actually that well equipped for addressing the ongoing prevention or management of health issues as they arise. And I think we can see that. And stunningly, I think what we've seen too is the general unpreparedness around seniors. And I think that's a real problem that is providing a lot of opportunity for, certainly for those of us working in new digital health solutions. But we're seeing amazing conversions. I think it'll be interesting to see if some of the companies, and maybe Wayne, your company is one of those kind of companies too, that has so much capabilities and capacity with the skills base that they can convert themselves. In your case, you've got industrial automation. I wouldn't be surprised at all for you to be starting to contemplate. You don't have to retain your focus there. You've got all sorts of skills that go beyond that. And I think it's not just a matter of us, and I have an engineering background, us and how we define ourselves and identify ourselves in our educational base, but us as companies and us as organizations that are looking at, we've already got lots of skills. How do we re-vector those, not just the individuals, but the organization, so that we're pressing forward. And I think we saw some great transition this year. And one of the things that really bothers me, what we saw this year, is that again, public bodies, they thanked a lot of organizations for pitching in and responding, but they didn't buy afterwards. They started buying internationally again. There's something just fundamentally wrong with some of that kind of stuff we see out there. And what they should be buying is they should be buying into Canadian tech companies, such as what we're building here in Edmonton and in Alberta. And I sell Edmonton, Bruce sells Edmonton, Ling sells Edmonton, Wayne, everybody here knows what we've got on capabilities and how we can address the next big things. So, just looking at one, I'll use this as a case example. In the future, and any innovator can go, look at whether it's a digital health or digital agricom, the clean tech kinds of things, climate change issues. We can address all of these things with knowing that we have great strength in Alberta. In our case, we're really starting to get into going beyond the wearable tech and how we can use AI and machine learning within community environments and help get into like new predictive analytics. We're also seeing opportunities around virtual clinics. The bricks and mortar of health is going to start to come down. It's going to start looking more like a bank. So this is my last slide. Just looking at the year, kind of summarizing. This is a note I found earlier today from the American Association of Medical Colleges. By 2030, could be a shortage of up to 100,000 physicians in the United States alone. Now, the good news is that that's an opportunity that we can serve. And so we can imagine that future with no more waiting lines, fully integrated services and delivery pathways using AI-based interactions and machine intelligence systems for next generation digital natives, such as my now 2-year-old granddaughter. So that's my presentation, and kind of a brief outline, but I hope you took something away from that today. Thank you.
One of the points that you made, Randy, which interesting, Wayne was addressing, which is the availability of capital. And you've made the point that there's a lot of capital out there. It's sitting there passively. How do we release it and see that it is in fact directed to our to our entrepreneurs? Well, there is someone out there that has an answer, and her name is Krista Freeland. And she said, give me your ideas and I will redirect and become the investor for you. How do we feel about government becoming the vehicle to make the investments in our entrepreneurs in Canada?
Well, I'll do a short answer to that. I don't feel particularly good about it. I think that the thing we need to see in society is, and I think it's going to take a little while yet, but I think we have to see some pain happening up there. That, you know, where the risk actually feels a little bit more like if you're not investing in me, you're probably going to lose. And I'm not meaning that in the sense that, hey, I'm such a great investment. The problem is going to be that by sitting on money and not looking at addressing risk capital at the startup stage, the country is going to suffer in a really serious way. And I don't think people have really fathomed that quite yet. But we have to make sure that message is being heard, because the existing economy is clearly in jeopardy.
Wayne, you wanna make a comment there? Off mute. You're muted still, Wayne.
Sorry, I didn't have my right thing selected, so my spacebar wasn't working right. A couple of comments on that. Perry, most of the people on this call are old enough to remember in the 80s, the Alberta government created something called VenCap. And it was well-intentioned. We want to stimulate spending. The problem became one of, you know, firstly, there's only so much a government can do, so it wasn't really that big of a fund and therefore didn't create a critical mass and couldn't do it all by itself. But the bigger problem is a venture capitalist investing in a company will expect, if you invest in 10 companies, you'll have 5 walking woundeds, maybe 2 wins, you know, sort of thing. 5 failures, 3 walking woundeds, 2 wins. If it's public money that's involved, the metrics get, ooh, a company failed. Why did you do that? You're wasting public funds. And so you have to be very, very careful about saying the government is an investor. Stimulus packages that leverage public funds are okay. I like the AEC model that we put a small amount of money in to draw other venture capitalists, which is smart money, not government smarts, but have heads-on stuff in that. So creating stimulus and packages, and the AEC leverage factor is nearly 5 to 1 for every dollar that comes out of the public person goes into a company. It draws 5 private funds and venture capital and LP funds into the space and creates presence in Alberta. And Calgary's really benefited from that. Edmonton, not as much, but Calgary very much. So be careful about that.
Well, I raise it to bring that very point to the surface, and that is government is typically risk averse. One of the features of economies that have been able to diversify is a mature public sector that understands the economy. Canadians' public sector is so heavily oriented to social services with very little understanding of economic matters that it's questionable whether government is at all or should be involved at all in investment decisions.
But there's a different type of investment, though, and Randy talked about that. And again, you talked about in the healthcare space, we need innovation here. They can be a much more active early adopter, which is more focused investment that's driving direct needs and things like that. That's way more effective.
Well, we have an opportunity in Alberta if the procurement system were to be used in the healthcare sector to the benefit of Alberta entrepreneurs. There is a lot of money flowing in and out of government to support the healthcare sector, but it's all public. It's a public service sector, and it seemed to me that one of the ideas is to allow more private opportunity in the public health sector. That's almost a revolution.
You need more than that.
Randy, you want to comment on that?
A culture shift.
Yeah, exactly. But that requires leadership. And the vision that we're getting is status quo of government becoming the investor. Send us your money. We've got more than enough capability to print money at the Canadian federal government level. And Krista Freeland says, just give us ideas. We'll figure out how we're going to spend it. Robert, you want to comment there?
Well, yeah, I think, quite frankly, the role of government is not to be the investor. The role of government is to be the catalyst to connect Canadian savings to Canadian capital stock development in innovation. There's a huge gap there. We have trillions of dollars of savings sitting in the stock market in speculative investments that is not expanding capital stock. So it's wrong to even call it investment. In the definition of economics, investment is resources used to expand capital stock, and almost none of our savings is doing that. So if we want real investments, I mean, the Canadian governments tend to look at foreign direct investment if they want to change the capital market structure. But how about domestic direct investment? But there is no capital channel between our potential huge pile of savings and the needs of our next generation.
Well, Randy,
We are building the economy of the future. Now, I would say that assets are the key to creating a capital channel.
and Randy,
Because we don't treat intangible assets appropriately, we don't have a formal principal security for investment in a technology startup, for instance, that has intangible assets underpinning it.
Randy's firm seems to be recognize the value of a personal asset called your body, and the amount of money that's being spent for Albertans at an individual level is enormous.
Yeah, but it's not in his balance sheet, is it? It's not in anybody's balance sheet.
So, Randy,
Yeah.
what's your view here?
Well, no, I do. I agree with both what Robert and Wayne is saying. I think that I think Canada is one of these kind of hybrid countries where we're not big enough to we have limited influence over how like world economies are developing, even though there's tremendous wealth here. It's a certain kind. It feels to me like it's a very certain kind of wealth. And so, and then secondly, it's been a very difficult place, and Alberta more difficult than other parts of the country. I think we see in Quebec as an interesting example on how the government or the public has done things to create incentivized supports that's been working, I think, for Quebec. But for Alberta, I think it's generally a mystery. So, it's a very, very hard place to innovate from, and the public, and to trust the public to make the decisions is really tough. I like the recent, at least it was as good as we could expect, of the Alberta Investment Tax Credit Program. I thought did some helpful things. But the government decided they didn't want to continue to support those ideas. I loved it because it encouraged people like you, Perry, and others who are really thoughtful angel investors to get involved. And so they created policy which was creating some sustainability and ability to innovate. But they took that away, and so now it's again a mystery as far as, well, what's public policy, so that we encourage the money that exists in private hands to start flowing to protect the economy, build the economy of the future. That's the big problem.
So the challenge here is we've seen, or we've heard, we've seen some statistics that Canadians are savers, and COVID is driving them to save, but they're not investors. And is that because I've listened to you over the years, your brother Russ Matichuk, Bruce, talk about whether or not it's a deal flow problem or whether it's a capital. Well, now we seem to have adequate capital. We may have adequate entrepreneurship. I'm not quite so sure, but the savers, the people holding the money, are not investors.
We have to overcome the false security that people have in the stock market. There is nothing more distressing to serious financial players than the distance that's growing between the real economy and the stock market. That is that's not a red flag. That's a roaring fire truck.
Explain yourself. The distance between the real economy and the stock market. What do you?
Yes, in theory, the stock market is a perfect reflection of the underlying economy. It's a bellwether. It's in efficient market theory. The stock market is a perfect reflection of the underlying value in the market.
So the stock market has been very excited about what's going on in the FANG world.
Well, of course, and you can see the stock market is gamed because it's rising to unprecedented levels at a time when the economy, every indicator in the real economy is bad and getting worse.
Yeah, but
and
that's-
about to get a whole lot worse.
But the stock market hasn't been a factor to gauge economic growth or progress.
It steals
Since
savings. That's
2008.
what it does.
Yeah.
It steals
I
our
know
savings.
that's what it should do, but when you pump in $38 trillion into it in 2008, it's not a real. I mean, it doesn't follow Keynesian economics anymore.
No, and the I can tell you the Fed under Trump has been pumping trillions of dollars into the quantitative easing bond buying program, which has been supporting the stock market.
Yeah, no,
And-
there's no economic connection between the stock market and the economy anymore. That's long gone.
Well, that's the reality. But economic theory says something quite different.
If it's working properly, yes.
Well, has it ever worked properly? I ask you that question.
The
Well,
point,
but the stock market functions, what's the purpose of the stock market? How does the stock market add value? There's no question it adds value, because what it provides is it provides a mechanism by which we can assess risk and therefore project and plan and invest in the future, right? So the stock market is an extremely important economic vehicle for financing and motivating innovation. With it, this is the thing about capital. Like, capital is what we use to we invest capital in order to create value. But what happens with value is we won't invest our capital if we think our capital is risky, right?
Mhm.
So what we do is we look around, we try to figure out how to reduce our risk. And so the stock market provides a mechanism for assessing risk and for incentivizing development.
No, it's perfectly rational for people to put their money in the markets. It has consistently performed in bad times and good times, and so. But what happens is now that 97% of our savings is in speculative investment and not generating Canadian capital stock. And from an economist point of view, we have an investment crisis. It's not a problem. There is literally no investment in Canada beyond a very, very few narrow bands. The average.
You're
the
saying
average
that
evi-
investments in the stock market aren't investments?
They're not investments. No, they're not.
Yeah,
investments.
but well, okay, so
They don't. Well, in the sense that, from the economist point of view, because they do not expand the capital stock.
well, but they make equity available to the participants in the economy. So if I am a company, let's say I'm a company, what do I need in order to make my company succeed? I need capital, right? Well, where do I get capital from? I either get capital from investors or I sell stock. Now, the thing is, let's look if I got investors and I need $1 million. Well, I can get $1 million if I get a bunch of people with $1 million of hard-earned cash. They can put that into my company, and maybe that makes my company go. But I can get that same kind of value at 10 or 20, and particularly in the tech area, I can get 10 or 20 times my leverage with stock, because if people believe in my company, my stock is now my $10 million company is worth 100 million or 200 million, because people are willing to bump up the value of my stock. And this is something that the stock market gives you that the regular economy doesn't give you. And so
No, I'm with you there. Yeah.
it's a mechanism to motivate and incentivize the drivers of an economy, and there's a huge penalty for companies that fail in their innovation. Their stock disproportionately goes down, right? And
and I'm not arguing against the stock market. What I'm saying is that we don't have a balanced investment portfolio in Canada, that we have too many speculative investments and not enough real investment. And so I would say that because we don't have the capital channels I mean, if say you're an RRSP holder in Edmonton, you walk into the bank and say, hey, it's RSP season, and your investment analyst says, well, here's your options.
Yeah.
Is there an invest in Alberta technology option? No.
Well, listen,
Well, I think that that's true. You know, that's the major problem. That's probably the biggest problem that we have, is that the dollars that I invest don't flow into supporting Canadian companies that are actually doing the innovation, or certainly not Alberta companies that are doing the innovation. So what, 80% of the money that goes into pension funds in Alberta is actually invested in out east, or not even out east, even in New York, even outside of the country. And what happens is that the decisions that they make for their companies have nothing to do with the Alberta economy, and they don't support the economy.
No, I've got friends in the financial markets in New York, and you say, we get these Alberta politicians coming through all the time saying, here's a great place to invest.
Yeah.
Fantastic returns.
Yes.
And they say, well, are Albertans investing in Alberta?
Yeah.
Show me the numbers.
Well, right.
well,
No, they're not.
They're not.
And so if it's such a great place to invest.
So time out for a moment. We're talking about what some refer to as an innovation ecosystem, whatever it is.
Very much.
And what we have is astounding. We have entrepreneurial initiative, and we have huge amounts of capital, because we're a relatively well-off province when it comes to the amount of savings that has been generated. What we can't seem to get these two things together. Do we need a stock market? Do we need to be training more people in less than accounting and put more people into investing? Do we need more investment companies? You're talking to me about a problem. I want to know a little bit more about a solution. I saw Tech Invest go out. ABC Tech spun it off. It looked like a great idea. It understood the value of intangible assets. It was in Alberta. It had some relatively smart people. What went wrong? Why isn't it working?
The major problem is just leveraging up our investments by focusing on what creates value, right? So, here's a really, really good example. So we have all of these smart people coming out of Edmonton, right? Well, a bunch of them went to a company called DeepMind out in the UK, right? So half of the team that formed DeepMind, they went to the UK. They were from the U of A, half of that team. Like David Silver, for example, who was the inventor of the AlphaGo project, was from the U of A. And a whole bunch of people out of the AI department went there. So they created this little tiny company. It was 20 people. That could have been created here in Alberta, but it was created in UK. Why? Because they have a system that recognizes the value of companies, and Google bought DeepMind from Hesibus for $500 million. Actually, it was 400 million pounds, which is, I don't know, it's about $600 or $700 million. Okay, so with a tiny amount of investment, and the same people that we could have here in Alberta, they had this huge. The UK had this massive, huge payday, right? And so how do we replicate that? That is the kind of thing that we're having a hard time. The major problem is that the markets, the capital markets, the markets where the investment is flowing, they do not recognize the value of innovation. So if you bring to the investors in the Alberta economy, so if you go say out to the New York, and you ask investors, what will you invest in Alberta? Well, they're going to tell you oil companies. They don't show you. We don't have.
But Bruce, we have the answer right in front of us. Roy has just posed a very interesting solution. Mm-hmm. We have ATB Financial that's owned by the government. It could be an instrument that is mandated to look at the savings for Albertans and become the Alberta Bank. So why is ATB? It was given $1 million by the former government, or $1 billion to allocate into Alberta. I gather it was principally used, however, to help back loans.
You don't have to give banks money; they make it.
So
they can manufacture it. Exactly.
So where is the instruments that we could be using here in Alberta to address this gap?
Well, they exist, but they don't flow into the innovation market.
Why not?
Innovation market. That's the question. Why not? They
believe
don't
it's
value innovation. They don't value companies that are at the startup stage.
Well, somebody put tax credit system in place, and then they bailed out and canceled it. But
I
mean,
believe there's
right,
some great ideas that are out there. We just get stuck in a conversation focusing on the problem.
that's my point. So
So
I'm
can I
saying,
inject one thing
Yeah.
with my own experience? I think what we need to do is convince the government to put a policy and funding in our border to encourage not only innovation, but utilization. Okay.
Sure.
So I can tell you example by examples when I travel around internationally with Canadian company from another province. Our border company have no chance to compete with other people. I'll give you one example. I was in Philadelphia 10 years ago, competing with a company from Montreal. Okay. Our border have nobody there, just myself.
right.
Montreal company, not only Montreal company is there, the investment officer from a Montreal company is there. When a local business, select which one to do business with, not only the Montreal company is there, the Montreal government said, if you take our company, we'll give you $10 million to do this project. Guess what happened next? That project take off like crazy. And why is doing that? Because our government does not have the policy and actually funding and the policy to make this happen. All our government's doing is oil and gas, oil and gas. I can give you example after example after example. I went to many, many different meetings, and where oil company gets a premium treatment, right? Funding, it's there.
Sure.
You go, we support you, we have you back. With any other company, if it's not oil and gas, they ignore you. You look like in the air. You don't even exist.
Well,
That's the major problem.
That is the
But
problem.
in a democracy where votes come as a byproduct of what a government is doing for a particular sector, Calgary represents a large number of votes, and the oil and gas industry is dominant in Calgary. So a government in a democracy is going to do what in fact the public is seeking. And it has been dominated by oil and gas. So to tell government to do something that is contrary to the voter is asking for a very unique form of leadership. In which case, the
That's
conclusion
the definition of leadership.
that you
So
can't.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So a good example. So I mean, it's managing that culture is what makes leadership in governments. And again, Rolf Klein wasn't my favorite politician on the planet, but he came with a very simple message: I'm going to kill the deficit so that your grandchildren don't have to live with it.
Right.
And it did a complete turnaround on profits. Now he had the advantage of an oil boom that happened to boost him along, but was able to align the perceptions and the strength of what people cared about. I was on a task force once, a few years ago with. Sorry, I just dropped a thought here. I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
Well, we are reaching a conclusion in 2 minutes. I said 5:30, and this is rich. I mean, I don't know why you each didn't bring a bottle of wine, because I've been drinking. I'm half through my bottle, but this was as rich as any seance which I've participated in the past. So I want to thank you for joining us. I think the format worked, Claire. We'd obviously like to see more participation, but as for next week, we'll be continuing the discussion, I think, on the digital economy. There's obviously multiple issues here, but I think we need more than talking to ourselves. It's somehow attracting others that are potentially influential. If you have something to share on the subject, let me know. I think we've got some questions, even whether democracy is the right vehicle for taking us into the future. Is the future a bright opportunity or a dark threat? Alberta seems to be stuck. I personally haven't seen much progress in 20 years on this topic of diversification. I'm not sure the professions are in very good shape given what's going on with COVID. I think it's demonstrated that those that are relying on public sector are in trouble.
Perry?
In a fully networked world, does privacy even matter anymore? I care, do you? Ling, you want to make some concluding comment or concluding observation?
No, I think we can talk Siri all day long, but I think if we want to do something, I think you have a perfect vehicle with that newsletter, is we need to driving some changes.
I'll tell you, let me reflect on that, because obviously with the newsletter and with the survey that we did, we generated some considerably valuable information in that survey. And I decided, and I was urged not to put it out in the form of an article, that it was more likely to be of more value and at least to be listened to, maybe viewed, by a series of episodes. I've looked several times at episode 5, which laid out what the impact of COVID has been and the state of the economy locally on Northern Alberta, Southern Alberta, Central Alberta, Edmonton, and Calgary. It is very rich data of how different Edmonton and Calgary are, and one of the dilemmas government has of bridging a very public sector dominated economy and a very heavily industrious economy in Calgary. That's a fundamental issue government has to address. But secondly, sectoral. If you look at what industries are in trouble in Alberta right now, tourism is being decimated. Tourism is being decimated by COVID.
Perry, can I say something?
A positive part of the economy. Oil and gas isn't doing that bad right now. But when you look at that data and you look at the recommendations that were spun out of that, there's some really rock solid material in there. I don't think anybody's paying attention. I really don't think the government is paying attention to what's going on in Alberta, other than the COVID crisis right now.
BK wanted to say something.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what I wanted to say was I heard that there's a need for software engineers. How many software engineers do we need? Show me the jobs. I'll get to the software engineers.
Oh, I'll tell you, through LinkedIn, I've helped build this network up to thousands. I get hundreds of requests for LinkedIn relationships from software graduates coming out of the University of Alberta that can't find jobs.
There you go.
They're there. And the number of companies in Alberta that zero in, as Wayne, he gave me a number, I've written it down here. The number, they're not finding the work.
I thought somebody said we needed 5,000 software engineers. I can find you all the software engineers you need.
But they're not being taken up by companies in the old traditional economy. They are not adapting to this new digital economy. Alberta continues to believe that wheat, meat, fiber, timber, oil, and gas to the US is its future. The digital economy, Alberta has not woken up, Wayne, to this reality.
Yeah. The thing is that, you know, when you look at software engineers and value, right? You don't need that many software engineers to create a multi-billion-dollar company.
Correct.
You need a few, right?
Right.
What you need is you need to know what the market needs. And one of the things that we're really bad at here in Alberta, frankly, is understanding, you know, product market fit, frankly. And so we end up creating a lot of companies that flounder or just don't really go very far because they never really get product market fit. And so you don't have these blockbuster companies that, you know, scale up into unicorns because they're just not attaching the innovation to market needs. So yes, I think that we need innovation, and we need innovation in all of our companies, but more than innovation, if we want to have a successful innovation economy, we need to have a much, much deeper understanding of how to attach innovation to market need and market demand.
Bruce, are companies in Alberta hiring software engineers to help them get into the digital economy, or are they continuing to hold on to their traditional way of doing business? Because it's one thing to say we're going to get a bunch of engineers to start a brand new economy. It's another one to take the existing companies and help them survive by looking at the market opportunities in the digital economy for the future. But I don't think there's a take up there.
Give me $1 million and we'll start hiring, Perry. We know we can do it.
Example,
we know what we're doing. So, and there's more companies like us.
But Randy, you are a perfect example and an excellent example of a grassroots starting from scratch. I don't know why it is that Alberta companies are not emulating what you've been doing, and why they're not buying into the future of the digital economy. We continue to be suppliers of wheat, meat, fiber, timber, oil, and gas with huge capital infrastructure for delivering it to the US. They're not converting.
Well, I'll tell you one of the biggest problems is that the entrepreneurial talent and the managerial talent required to make that leap from innovation to market demand are massively incentivized to leave the province. So I can go, buddy of mine who he worked with me at Cellcorp, spent a decade selling product all around the world, right? When Cellcorp, we couldn't find enough capital to keep Cellcorp kind of at its level. We ended up selling the thing out to a U.S. interest. But so at the time he left, he spent a while in the Alberta market, and then he went to and he just couldn't find anything to raise his company. He went over to Boston, and within a year he found investors. He raised over $10 million. He runs this very successful company called, Voice User Interface. And it's just something that just happened because he went to Boston, where money was just flowing everywhere. And so this is if we want to address this problem of innovation to market fit, we have to figure out how to over incentivize key executive talent. We need to either bring him back or force him to stay. And that can be done through a variety of means, tax incentives, education, whatever it is, but you have to have the talent. If you don't have the talent, you aren't going to create the companies that take you to the next level.
Yeah, well, talent is one thing. I think talent's like water. They go where the lowest point or highest pay goes. I think it's the market really needs to drive. My struggle, and a lot of people I know, Randy's struggle, is we have technology, we have products, but we have no intakes in our border. It forces us to go elsewhere.
Well, I don't want to end up on a negative note, but let's call
Randy,
it
right?
let's call it a day. It is 5:30, and that was a promise to wrap up about this time. But I thank you all for hanging in there. I'll send you a reminder and agenda for next Friday. I've got a couple of people. If any one of you would like to bring a presentation or know of someone who would like to make a presentation on the topic of the digital economy and or diversifying our economy, let me know. But until then, Claire, thanks for helping. I don't know whether you've got a closing slide there to put on the share screen. He's muted. I'll leave him be. Okay, Claire, hang on, because I need to talk to you one-on-one after this is over. So thanks, Tom, for showing up. Thanks, Roy. Thanks, Shirley, Randy, Bill, BK, Ling, Bruce. Good night.
Yeah, good night, guys.
Good night.
Thank
you.
That was really fun.
See you next week.
Hire the software engineers, I'll find them.
I've hired several out of the university over the years, and they're all really quite amazing. And we have some of the best people that are coming out of those universities. It's just amazing. Just Perry, just a quick comment. This format works really well.
Yeah, I think
it's
does.
going to be.
Thanks, Tom.
Really something. Yeah.
I think we're okay. This felt like our seances, a little bit of discipline. I think bringing in some presenters does in fact enrich the discussion. Shirley, what were your observations? I mean, you're rather silent. You usually are, but would you unmute your computer and tell us what you thought about the session?
I thought it was a great session. Very worthwhile topics that were brought up today. Very informative and will lead into future discussions.
Good, thanks.
But Perry, this is what we have to do, eh? This is what is absolutely necessary on the road ahead, is just this communication between entrepreneurs and people interested in the company.
Perry, on a different issue, do you want to hear a story?
Sure. I think you probably want to tell me one.
Okay. How many City of St. Albert employees does it take to prune a tree?
How
many St. Albert boys did it take to prune a tree? I'll go downtown and take a look, but why?
Okay. On my road,
yeah,
we had 2 big trucks with the buckets. We had another small truck. So we had one truck cutting when the guy in the bucket cutting the branches, one guy feeding the branches into the crusher, and 3 guys standing by and watching.
Okay, so So what is your conclusion?
It's a very, very inefficient operation out there.
Wait. Time out. Who employed those individuals?
We did.
Okay, and toward what end?
Towards what end? To get a job done
Okay.
as efficiently as possible.
Do you know who Bismarck was?
No.
Bismarck was a German leader who helped build their economy by digging holes and filling holes. And why did Why did he do that?
Yeah.
Because government is engaged to create jobs, to redistribute wealth.
Yeah.
That is brilliant. If they only had 10 people cutting down the tree, somebody's going to come along and figure out some way to get 12 or 15 or 20, because we need to give them jobs to distribute money into the economy.
Yeah, but who pays for it?
Does. The taxpayer pays it.
Yeah,
and you don't seem to have a problem, and Canadian taxpayers don't seem to have a problem with paying taxes.
I got a huge problem.
Excuse me for a second. The thing is, it comes down to safety. What you're talking about is an extremely dangerous operation.
Tom,
a tree.
Tom, then
come on.
And what's wrong with
to have somebody there to pull the guy out of the bloody grinder?
Time out.
Or the branch that pulls.
So now we have danger. And what happens in danger? You send one to the hospital. And what do they do in the hospital, which is a public sector? We have a lot of jobs in the hospital, because the more people that get injured, the happier we are, because we're creating more jobs in the public health system.
We haven't got room in there.
You don't understand an economy that is dominated by government. Creating jobs is not about efficiency. It's about distribution of wealth.
BK, that's a private company, isn't it, that you were talking about?
Sorry?
What, the
no,
hospital?
it's the city of St. Albert.
Yeah, it's the city of St. Albert.
Oh.
And
that's like a private company.
I live on a crescent with 20 houses. There's probably 30 trees, and it took them 5 guys. It took them 3 days.
Okay, but you have. I'm not joking here. When I was in Ottawa with the Eric Nielsen Task Force, and I was the director of privatization in Alberta, which is a transition from public sector services to private sector when the market forces are adequate to discipline costs and standards. And when I got to Ottawa, my role and why I was appointed by the Alberta government to go there was to introduce the discussion about the role that the private sector could help in increasing the efficiency, the effectiveness, and the economy in Canada. And I was stunned to find, this is how wet behind the ears I was. And you all sound like you're wet behind the ears too. Because I was told that the role of government was to create jobs in order to redistribute wealth given to them in the form of tax. That's what my comment was about Krista Freeland. You give her the money, she will create a lot of jobs to get people back to work. They don't have to be efficient. So when we talk efficiency, we talk private sector will give you efficiency and effectiveness and economy. The difficulty we have with our public services is they haven't been ready because we didn't have informed consumers, and we had ideologically committed people that government will do it well and the private sector will take profits and not do anything effective. It's bullshit. It's time for us to start thinking seriously about the waste that we have of the taxpayer money going to create jobs that are doing nothing, and allow the public sector like Randy to play an increasing role in our economy so Canada can become efficient. The reason people don't invest in Canada is we don't think effectively and efficiently. We love government. Every time we sit down to have one of these discussions, the first thing I hear is, what can government do to help us? Oh, Trudeau would love to help us, create more jobs, take more taxpayer money, or print it and move it around. Until we wake up about the role of the private sector in the economy, we're going to continue to have this discussion for 50 more years.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's vote out the council.
Okay.
Well, look at
you all. Have a good weekend.
They're very efficient and effective in the economy of picking up my garbage. They contracted that out. Yeah. But these guys that are working in construction, which is infrastructure projects, which is the way Franklin Roosevelt helped get the Depression out of the way, is they took government money, put it into infrastructure projects, built bridges, fixed roads, built dams, That's what we're doing in Canada right now to try and get people back to work. But that's not creating wealth in your economy. That's just
It's too bad that our present government isn't doing that.
LRT or something like that. Roy, what was your comment there?
It's too bad that our present government isn't doing that. Instead, they're spending money on propaganda machines.
Yeah. Well, the government, I sat in the policy convention in Calgary last spring before COVID, and did hear that the government we have today did want to move in this direction of beginning to allow private sector to play a stronger role in public service delivery. Unfortunately, COVID hit, and anybody's agenda of fixing the economy has become secondary to saving people's lives. My concern, I don't know whether any of you know what took place in the Middle Ages after the plagues. The plagues of the 13th century is what created the Middle Ages, which basically gutted the economy for 100 years. We are not going to be out of this COVID mess for a long while. We are gutting our economy. When 40% of small businesses will die, you're going to have one hell of a lot of people living on welfare for a long
time. Yeah, that's right.
It's going to be bad. Just, the thing is that company that is going to be picking up your garbage or is picking up your garbage, they're the ones who have been cashing in on this. Did you read this in the paper today about this? These guys, these big players back east who have been cashing in on these queues payments and everything else. They've been taking money and paying dividends to their companies.
If the government would get the hell out of service delivery and get back to regulating the economy, maybe some of these things would be dealt with. But government's got hands in too many pockets. And for it to play an effective role in regulating the economy, it has to get out of being compromised by being so heavily into direct service delivery itself.
Yeah,
that's right.
Okay, we have now moved 47 minutes or 7. I don't know. This is fun.
I think time to call it quits, eh?
Yeah, we don't ever have to call it quits. This is fun, but for those, Bill, you've been the quiet guy. Bill, what are you here for? What are you listening to? Unmute yourself and introduce yourself, Bill. He doesn't know how to unmute himself. No. Well, you got yourself muted. All right. Well, good night, gentlemen. Good night, ladies. Good night, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Great.
Claire, you hold on for a minute longer. You and I need to talk. The general feedback, Claire, is
there we go.
Hello, Bill. So what was your takeaway, Bill?
I'm a little interested in the subject. I guess my background is mostly being private sector in the commodity chemicals area, research labs and engineering.
Okay.
Half of my career in the federal government research lab. The high tech, the most interesting thing to me was what I missed, because I've been working on a project this afternoon. In fact, I'm still working on it, as you guys have been talking. Since 1988, my #1 priority hobby has been neural networks.
Okay.
And I'm somewhat familiar with the Edmonton group under Richard Sutton, and it's of course, but also conversations over the years. I lived in Quebec for a while and took economics as night courses just for the fun of it. And they were always wringing their hand on how to expand in their economy and take advantage of future industries and that. They're much more statist mentality, though.
Well, they come out of
so they have a certain way of approaching it.
But the Quebec, to their credit, has focused very much on the economy. Heavy public sector involvement, great involvement in the Eastern U.S. markets, because they've got easy access to the U.S. market. But Alberta seems to have had a very good economy for a long while based on oil and gas. And so the government didn't have to pay much attention to industry. Industry was basically keeping the province going. And Edmonton benefited with a strong health and education sector, a lot of public sector money helping out Edmonton's economy. But when Calgary went into the tank and Edmonton began to suffer about a year later, that's now. And I don't think they know how the hell to get out of this. If we can't get oil and gas back, they don't know how to recover $60 billion worth of economy. They're talking hydrogen. There are some interesting things that talk as alternatives.
I think this is a lot of regions face the same problem. Quebec's had that same problem. They're much larger, of course, historically than Alberta. But it's kind of a favorite thing to do is to diss the resource industries. And yet, if you look at them, there's a tremendous amount of science and technology that goes in. There's a tremendous amount of purchasing of high-end technology things from around the world into those industries.
Right. But they
because you can't do everything yourself.
Well,
you know, it's in the case of Montreal, they've had telecommunication successes. They have an enormous effort, much larger, I think, than the University of Alberta in the area of deep learning neural networks. Joshua Bengio and a whole pile of people in 4 or 5 universities in Montreal. But even there, they claim to have the city center in the world, or some phrase like that. I took that the wording for Joshua Bengio's presentation last summer for the World Congress on Computational Intelligence, because I couldn't confirm it. Everybody likes to say they're the biggest. But again, they're always working hard to try to build this sort of things. You're talking about some of the same issues that have been around forever. And in Ottawa, I was very actively attending a lot of the stuff on following up on the tremendous high-tech successes they had. And again, there was a lot of government money in there and a lot of private money. I'm not so sure it's not an easy issue to grapple with. The venture capital, the financing and all that, that's a tough business. I mean, there's some areas that do it much better than others. The conditions in the country have a lot to play with that as well. Attitudes and free people are to actually get ahead and do things. Do we have enough wealthy people in Canada?
Well,
maybe I'm being blunt, but sometimes you need people with money.
No, well, let me just spend a moment on that, because I talked to Laura Kilcrease, who's the CEO of Alberta Innovates, and she was hired out of Texas, where she had played a significant role in helping Austin, Texas, do a conversion of their economy from almost pure oil and gas, a very strong academic sector with the University of Texas. And I asked her, you know, why do you think you've been hired, and why have you come up to Alberta? And she said, because the conditions in Alberta are very similar to the conditions we had in Texas. And I think what I learned in Texas, I can share here with you in Alberta. And I think that's why they hired me. So I met with her a year later, last spring, in fact. And I said, Laura, you've been at it now for a couple of years. What have you learned? She's learned we got a lot of money in Alberta, like we had a lot of money in Texas, except it's new money. It's nouveau riche. Nobody wants to let go of it. They won't reinvest their money. They hold on to it. They buy their planes, they buy their properties, they buy their real estate, but they don't reinvest their capital. So we've got capital, but it's nouveau riche capital. We've got money sitting in savings accounts. But
I like that comment. Yeah, I like that comment. That's a very interesting observation.
But
and I don't know how often it occurs, but so often it seems
to take that
generate the big businesses.
To take that someplace is to understand that it's very difficult to compare Alberta, even with Quebec or with New York or Silicon Valley. Alberta is new. It's young people. They haven't had the experience of failing and succeeding and failing and succeeding, and all of what you need in order to build the experience and to mature that ecosystem that people are prepared to make investments. A lot of people made a lot of money in Alberta, got freaking lucky. We need.
Alberta's not new though.
We need.
We're not new.
We are outside of.
We're
outside of wheat meat.
We're competing against countries that are very young.
We're competing.
And they're growing fast.
we're competing very well in traditional economies of wheat, meat, fiber, timber, oil, and gas. That has been our economy, but we've not transitioned the economy into the new economy. We're still wedded and committed, and we have a capital infrastructure of highways and pipelines and rail to basically feed the U.S. market tangible assets, and it's what our economy is. And yet
we're stuck in oil and gas.
No.
Oil and gas. The
No,
price
we're
is
stuck
bad.
we're
the
stuck in
environment is bad.
we're stuck in agriculture, forestry, and oil and gas, and we're stuck there because the capital investment infrastructure is very expensive, and you're not going to transition.
You know, I don't know, because I mean, to me, it comes back to some of these older discussions from the past. You've got Korea, you've got Taiwan, you've got tons of countries like that that haven't had the advantages of Alberta from the past. Maybe the biggest advantage they had is that they're hungry. And I think another thing that's completely missing a bit in the discussion is the sheer scale of what's coming. I mean, in the area of computational intelligence,
right?
And I don't artificial intelligence, because the new stuff is, to me, almost the exact opposite of our artificial intelligence. Well, China is absolutely humongous. I mean, in the Neural Networks Journal, in the transactions on neural networks and learning systems, half to 2/3 of the papers are regularly from communist China.
Right.
They're huge.
Right.
I mean, what you're dealing with there, and the students there are super competitive, right? I mean, it's just a different world. I don't know if we know what we're up against.
Oh, I spent a year in Taiwan.
A really laid back university.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So much of this discussion can become very discouraging because we know we have a problem.
Yeah, but I'm not trying to be discouraging.
No, I'm not.
I think the thing is, if you recognize your challenge, if you recognize the challenges and try to do something about it, and you know, a lot of my favorite scientists, China, India, all over the world, Iran even, you know, Arab countries have tremendous power in scientists and mathematicians, and you don't usually hear about that. Japan is sort of disappeared out of the limelight a bit, but they're very powerful as well. So what are we really up against in terms of competition? You've been talking a lot about the financing that's so effective in the States, and other countries are trying to do that as well. But I think it's also how many kids are willing to actually work that hard, you know, and what have we got in terms of certain conditions to encourage people to kind of effort. I don't know if it's mostly wealthy people coming from overseas. I don't think so, but you know, some of them definitely from better off families. It's just a whole, I think the thing I see is it's a very difficult issue everybody is grappling with, and they all want to be like North Carolina and you know, the Stanford Research Triangle and the whole bit about it. Everybody's trying to compete to do that, and I know a way that there has been a tremendous amount of advanced technology in Alberta all along. Don't ignore it just because it was working for oil companies or coal or agriculture or anything else like that. Those are the stuff to build on, and there are some pretty good success stories in Alberta as well. Yeah, I don't think it's an easy thing to tackle.
Well, I mean, my bottom
off
line,
to you for doing that.
My bottom line on this is, even if it was easy, which it isn't, Alberta does not have the experience of being market oriented. It has been a commodity producer and shipper. It has not got savings money that is targeting investments here in Alberta. The money typically goes to Toronto and then gets redistributed from Toronto, or it goes to the government and gets redistributed by government into jobs. Maybe we need an Alberta stock market. Maybe we need some way to educate are savers of the opportunity to invest, because if they don't, their kids aren't going to have jobs in the future here in Alberta. But let's call it a day here. This has been exciting. We go over this ground many times, and I think Ling is the one who raises the point. What can we do about it? And I write about it, and I bring people together to learn about it. I don't think there is a level of awareness, though, of how serious our future issue is, though, Bill. You raise the point of awareness. I still think Alberta is living in a bit of a la-la land, that somehow this economy will be adequate to support a population of 4.5 million. That population of 4.5 million is double what it was 20 years ago because of oil and gas. And if oil and gas isn't going to recover to the level that it did, we got a problem, a big problem.
Yeah. So what are we going to do about it?
Well, we'll talk about that next week. Good night, gentlemen. Bye.
Okay.